Hey everyone, it's Bethany from Chicago Gardener out here on my back deck garden. And what I wanted to do today is go over some of the pros and the cons associated with container gardening. So I have now been container gardening. This is my 5th season. I'd say technically I've had small gardens with like a few pots in the past, but in terms of having like a real legit garden, it's been about 5 years now. So I definitely can tell the benefits and disadvantages to having to grow everything in pots. Now, the reason I do is because we don't have a yard, but we have these 2 great rooftop decks which get full sun. So for me, container gardening is the way to go. And that's my first benefit, is that you can do it anywhere. As long as you have an outdoor space, you can put a pot out there and put a plant in the pot, and now you have a garden. Even if you don't get full sun, there are plants that work in full shade situations, so you might not be able to grow as much as you want, but you can still create a garden. So for me, I know I was putting off having a garden, even though I've wanted one ever since I was helping my grandparents out in theirs when I was little. I kept thinking I would have to wait till we got a yard, moved out of the city, and it's been, how long have I been here now? 11 years in Chicago. So if I didn't start container gardening, I would still be waiting probably a long time. So that is definitely the first benefit when it comes to mind, is that container gardening really opens up the ability to garden for a lot more people than it would be if you had to wait until you had a yard. My next benefit is that I don't get very many weeds. I spend very little time weeding my garden. Sometimes I'll say weeds will get in usually when the plants are smaller, but as the plants grow, they're taking up all the room in the containers. They're not letting seeds kind of fall through. And so I barely ever pull weeds. It's not a problem in my garden, and I am so incredibly thankful for that. I mean, sometimes I'll get like a maple tree trying to grow between the slats in my deck for some reason. So I might pull like 1 or 2 every week. So for me, because I know how time consuming that can be or hard to control, that can be for some people, I'm very grateful I don't have weeds. And kind of going off of that, it's much easier for me to grow plants that might be considered invasive or easy to spread than it would be for someone else. Now, I do want to make sure if I'm growing anything like morning glory, that if the seeds do fall off, for me, they fall onto a deck, or if they blow over, they fall onto a cement sidewalk. So they're not blowing onto ground where they can then grow, which is really nice if you do want to grow something like that can very, very easily spread throughout your garden. Same thing with mint. If you put mint in the ground, it'll take over, or if you put it in a pot with other things, it'll take over. So for me, being able to grow mint in one pot, I can more easily control the size of plants that want to spread and just go crazy. Now, again, if you're planting on the ground in a container, like say I had this morning glory in a pot on the ground, the seeds could fall off into the yard. So if your containers are on a yard or are on soil, do be careful of that. But for the most part, at least I can control these a little bit more aggressive plants. The next benefit is that I have total control over the soil quality in my containers. So obviously you're in charge of putting whatever you're going to put into your pots. I don't have to worry about, is my soil to have too much clay? Is it too sandy? I know exactly what growing medium I'm using. Now, does that mean that sometimes I buy low quality soil because the bags were on sale and I wanted a bunch of bags for cheap and then it killed my plants? Yes, that has happened. Might have happened this year, but I do have much more control than I would if I had to plant in the ground. That also means that you can grow some things that maybe wouldn't work as well in your ground. So now I have lost blueberries to blight, but I was able to more easily acidify that soil. Same thing when I had a blue hydrangea, but now I don't care about that as much. But I can much more easily control the growing medium of my plants, and I can adjust it for different plants based on what they like, which is really nice. The next benefit is mobility, especially if you put your containers on wheels, if they are too heavy for you to move on your own. But I move my pots around, I would say much more often kind of earlier and at the end of the season, a little bit less often during the middle of the season. But if I plant something and I realize it's either in too much sun or not enough sun, I can pick up the pot and move it somewhere else. Now, this doesn't apply to my raised beds, which are way too heavy for me to ever move. But like with my hydrangeas, I'll realize that they're getting too much sun, so I can move them to a shadier part of my deck. I had some plants, also my hydrangeas, that were getting too much water, so when it rained, I could move those inside. So I have the ability to move plants around my deck based on their needs at that moment. And that can be really fun. Also, when plants get too big, so if I have my pots together and one starts to overcrowd the one in the next pot, I just scooch them farther apart. So I love the ability to basically rearrange my garden throughout the season. It's not something I'd be able to do if everything was planted in the ground. In fact, that's one of the things I think about if we did ever have a yard and a garden, is all of the plantings seem so much more permanent than they do out here. So I think that would be much more stressful to try to put the plant in the right pot. Obviously you can dig it up and move it, but that's a lot harder to do than just shifting your pot around. My next benefit is accessibility, and this definitely applies more to my raised beds. But I love being able to stand up and garden. And that's not something I would necessarily be able to do if everything was planted at ground level. Now, a lot of my pots are still at ground level, but having flowers up higher, having like my tomatoes up higher because they're in my really tall grow bags, just makes gardening a lot easier. I mean, I am 37 now, so luckily I can still move my body and use it in the ways that I want to. But especially as I get older, it's nice to have that ability to have things kind of at your level, so you're not always like crouching down while you garden. Another benefit is that I have fewer pests. Now, a good portion of that is because I'm growing on a rooftop deck. So rabbits, deer, cats, although I wish I had cats coming up here, those can't get to my garden, so they can't bother it. I also, though, don't have many issues with birds. In fact, I don't think I've ever had a single issue with a bird eating my blueberries. What else would they want? Maybe my raspberries, but they've just never been interested in my garden. Or maybe it is because I'm like out here so often, they're just afraid of me. I don't know what it is, but I definitely have fewer pests. But even if you're just gardening in containers at ground level, there can also be benefits. For example, I don't have to worry about moles or anything that might be in the ground digging holes through the soil. Now, obviously squirrels and other things like that can go dig in your pots, but I don't have to worry about any of the pests that are kind of like living in the ground or underneath the soil, again, because everything is contained. So fewer pests up here specifically for a rooftop, but gardening in containers does help manage at least some of the pests that you might experience down on the ground. And then the final benefit, or at least the last one on my list, is that growing in containers lets me extend my garden season in a few different ways. So I can get a head start, one, by starting plants in pots inside. So my dahlias, for example, if I overwintered them, I bring them inside in early April, which is way too soon to plant them outside here. Or I will plant my new ones in April and just keep the container inside until it's warm enough to move them out. That gives me a full month to a month and a half of growth before getting them outside. If I was just planting them outside after our last frost, I would be so much further behind. So in a normal season, this is not a normal dahlia season, I will have dahlia blooms by early July, if not end of June, which is much sooner than if I planted it directly outside. So that's one way that I can extend my growing season. Also, the soil in pots heats up a lot faster, and a lot of plants, like seeds for example, need a certain soil temperature. Plants will start sprouting at a warmer soil temperature. So my pots heat up a lot faster. It means they also cool down a lot faster at the end of the season, but it does help me to get things started in my garden much sooner than I would if I just planted everything in the ground and had to wait for that soil to heat up. Now, on to some cons. The first one is going to be, even though you have total control of your soil, you have to buy your soil. And a lot of the times, either the soil or the container are the most expensive part of my garden, especially as I'm looking for larger containers. I wouldn't have to buy pots or buy soil if I was just planting in the ground. Now, I might have to put some money towards amending the soil, and I would probably need to put money towards more tools to garden with, but it can be a good chunk of change when you're first starting off, especially to gather up all the pots that you want, to buy all the soil that you need. Now, I don't change out my soil each year. I do in my smaller pots, but in my raised beds, I will get compost, which again, I will have to buy, but you'll have to get compost anyway if you're gardening in the ground. And then I put that into my raised beds to refresh it that way, because there's no way I would want to, one, spend the money to change out all of my soil, and two, I don't know where I would put it or how I would get it down. So that is one thing that you want to kind of balance out. Like, yes, I do have total control over the soil quality, but also I have to buy all of the soil. Next is that pots are going to dry out a lot faster than in the ground. And similarly, when you fertilize, that's going to leach out a lot faster too. So with my pots drying out, I think probably most of my plants I'm watering, well, once a day. Some are about once every 2 days, but some I have to water twice a day because either the pots are smaller or the plant just is a very thirsty plant. Like my morning glory, I always have to water twice a day, it seems like, in the peak of summer. So you are going to have to water more often. However, kind of on the flip side of this, I definitely experience more root rot and waterlog from the containers than I would in the ground. If we get a lot of days in a row of rain, it's my smaller pots that just stay waterlogged, and there's really nowhere else, especially down, for the roots to grow to look for drier soil with more oxygen. So I have to be careful both of my pots drying out too much and of my pots getting too much water, where it just seems to be a little bit more well regulated if you were gardening in the ground. Another downside is that you are going to be limited by the size of your containers. Now you can get very large containers. I mean, there's containers that exist that are larger than my raised beds, but I am limited in some of the things that I can grow if I want to get them to a full size. Like maybe I could try a tree in a pot, which I have a plum tree, might get some evergreen trees, but I know at some point they're going to reach their maximum and they're just not going to get any larger. They're going to outgrow their pot. And if I don't have a larger pot to repot them into, that's pretty much going to be the end of their life. I know someone that does do evergreens, and he just at some point knows that the evergreen that's in the current pot is going to die. He's going to have to take it out and put in a new plant. With that too, you do have to worry about repotting. So I have some hydrangeas, I have my apple trees, my cherry tree in a much smaller pot right now that I'm going to have to upsize as they start to get larger. Now, the plants that I'm growing are all smaller varieties, so they should max out at a size that can still grow just fine in a container. But you do have to worry about that. Whereas if I could just plop it in the ground, it can just sit there and grow and reach its full mature height. So you are going to be limited both by the container sizes that are available, and you're going to have to put in that extra work to repot your plants when they are ready. Another con is that I have to worry about how heavy these plants are. Now, this is also because I garden on a rooftop deck, but if you garden on any sort of deck or patio or balcony, you want to make sure that you're not putting too much weight on it, which again isn't something that you really have to worry about in the ground. So make sure that you know your deck capacity before you start to add, especially really heavy plants or really large containers, because typically, unless you're growing again like a giant tree, what's going to weigh the most or add the most weight to your deck are either the containers themselves, like my raised beds. I mean, they're not super heavy, but they're heavier than the plants inside of them, and the soil. The soil is really what adds weight really quickly to any space that you are gardening on. So as long as you know your deck capacity, you're not going to cause any structural damage. But again, something that you're not going to have to think about if you're just growing your plants directly into the ground. So that is everything that's on my list. I'm sure there are more. So if you container garden as well and have any pros or cons, let me know down below. I also think, like, part of me dreams of having a yard and a greenhouse one day, but part of me wonders if I would love it as much. I do think, and maybe this is just because this is what I have experience with, but I do think it's easier to garden in containers, again, just because of the control that I have. But maybe that's just because I haven't really gardened not in containers to know that it's not so bad either. But I just think there's less that I have to worry about in comparison, especially again being on a rooftop compared to people who garden in ground, at ground level. So yeah, let me know your thoughts. Again, let me know if you have any other benefits or drawbacks to your container gardening, and I will see you in the next one.